Welcome back to our continuing study in the Gospel of Matthew. I thank you for taking the time out of your busy life and schedule to spend some time and reflecting on the teaching of Matthew the Apostle. If you like this video, provide a like, subscribe, and most of all, allow God through His Spirit and through His grace and mercy to call you to the life that He has envisioned for you since the foundation of creation. Matthew chapter 28 and verse 7. I am going to be reading out of the Good Speed translation, which is a part of the American Bible. Matthew chapter 28 and verse 7. Now go quickly and tell his disciples he has risen from the dead and is going back to Galilee before you. You will see him there. Now I have given you my message. The first thing we want to note here is how this verse functions as a tool of the narrative of Matthew. Now, please understand, we're not saying it's not as was spoken, but there is a sense in which Matthew is taking what has happened, what was said, and using it to further his story along. You know, in that sense, as we keep saying, that the Gospels are not just simply giving us a chronological account of the life, teaching, and ministry in Jesus. In this verse, he's setting the stage for the closing verses of the Gospel account of Jesus. In other words, how do we go from the apostles being in Jerusalem to them being in Galilee? And so he's setting the stage through this. And he's beginning the shift. There's going to be another bit of verses dealing with the women, and then he's going to transition to the Roman authorities and how they deal with the question of the Jewish and Roman authorities, how they deal with the death of Jesus and his subsequent resurrection. And then it's going to close with the final message and charge to the apostles. If you compare each of the Gospels, the Gospel of Luke and John and Matthew, you find there are a number of events recorded by all the Gospel writers, but not all the same events. So the great example is if you turn to Luke's account of the resurrection, you have the story of the disciples who are unnamed on the road to Emmaus and their ongoing conversation with the resurrected Jesus. And kind of my point is that when we look at the gospel accounts, understand that there are a number of events that happen after the resurrection, and some of these are overlapping. And how do you craft a narrative to make sense of these things while operating in the confines of limitation of space? There is some reason to believe that these gospel writers knew that they were aware of and knew that they had to get their material within one scroll. So the Gospel of Matthew, for example, takes up most of one scroll. They didn't want to put their Gospels in numerous or a second scroll. In Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 15, we have these words: one witness is not enough to convict anyone accused of any crime or offense they may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. The New International Version rendering of this. Now, this was a basic part of Jewish legal understanding. You have to provide, though, one little teeny weeny clarification. When it says the need for witnesses, understand how that was understood. And that was understood to say male witnesses. In that sense, female witnesses did not cut it. And I know that is extremely sexist, and that's my point. For when we read the gospel accounts of the resurrection, notice how Jesus turns to the women to provide the first set of witnesses to the resurrection. what was going on here. It is a symbol of how things are not the same in the New Age. The role of women is elevated. Women will and must have a role in announcing the good news. So at the very first, on the first Easter, we see that these women who were there become the first witnesses. And that's very much contra Jewish legal traditions and Jewish legal understandings. And yet, when we look at it, it is in a sense very much in keeping because there was multiple witnesses, not just one. But these witnesses were women. And if Jesus could do this, what does it say about the church, whose history, sad to say, often relegates women to secondary roles in the work and ministry of the church? In modern North American evangelicalism, we have bought into the mantra of our culture that to be busy is to be blessed. In our culture, the important people are those who always have something of significance to do. In our quest to create churches in the image of our culture, we have created all sorts of church activities. In a sense, Jesus cuts us down to one thing. The church is to be about the fact that he has risen from the dead. Look at some churches and all they do and ask, do people in the community get the sense that the church is about the resurrection of Jesus from the dead? Does the message that is most important that the church is custodian to, that Jesus is risen from the dead, get lost in all of that? You see, what the church is to be a witness to is what the women were witness to. Jesus has risen from the dead. You see, any church that does not make it clear to all who come and all who attend that he is risen from the dead has failed in its mission as a church. Now, again, it is possible that weeks passed between Passover, that the weeks that passed between Passover and Pentecost were some of the most important time that Jesus spent with his apostles. In that time, the resurrected Jesus appeared to the apostles and more. In the final times that Jesus spent with his apostles, there would have been times of teaching. And the teaching of Jesus and about Jesus would be seen in a new light. And these weeks of transition, Jesus was doing the final preparation for his departure, when his followers would take over the work. We are not given comprehensive accounts and details from this time. Instead, we are given, well, we could say snippets, a bit here, a bit there, but not much more. What we can say is that this was a time of graduation for these people. The book work was done and the exams were behind them, and now they were to take the mantle from Jesus and to begin to build the church. Graduation was complete when the day of Pentecost came, and the church was built on one truth and one teaching, that Jesus is risen from the dead, and that was what the church was to be a witness to. The resurrection of Jesus speaks of the power and might of his death. And apart from the resurrection, we as a church do not have a mission nor a mandate.